Welcome, everybody. It's great to have so many of you all here today. I think we can wait just a moment to let folks join since we're right at 11. But I'm really glad to have you all here today. My name is Jadine Sonada, she, her pronouns, and I am with the Sierra Club chapter in Wisconsin if I haven't met you before. We've got some great speakers here today, and if you'd like to introduce yourself and say hi in the chat, then that's welcome. But yeah, we're going to wait just a minute or two to let people get into the room, and then we'll get started. Okay, I think I'm gonna go for it. And as folks trickle in, they can get a little bit caught up. So again, welcome everybody. It's great to have you here. Thank you for all of your interest. I know there's been a lot of excitement about this Lunch and Learn, and we're really happy to have you all here. So as I said, my name is Jadine. I work for the Sierra Club chapter in Wisconsin, and we are co-hosting this Lunch and Learn with Healthy Climate Wisconsin. Abby is here representing HCW, and there's been a whole host of work happening on hyperscale data centers in Wisconsin, as I'm sure many of you know. And so we're excited today to be talking a little bit more about one of the particular issues that has come up a lot, which is data centers and their water impacts. Um, Obviously, data centers are a major issue with like a lot of different factors that play into them and a lot of different pieces that people are concerned about. But we have heard that water is something that is really high on people's list. So there are a lot of Wisconsinites who care a lot about water use, clean water, etc. And we have some great speakers here today to tell us a little bit more about how data centers are using water and potential concerns about how that is happening. So hopefully all goes well and you can see my slides. If you have any like tech questions or anything as we keep going, feel free to put something in the chat and Abby and I can help you out. But I'm just going to give a short introduction to our speakers and then I'll turn it over to them to share more. They're going to do a little bit of presentation for us all today, and then we're going to have some actions led by Abby and then a Q&A. So if you have any questions that come up throughout the presentation, feel free to pop them in the chat and we can do our best to gather them all together and get them answered for you at the end of our time together today. So with that, I'll get us officially started. So as I said, we have two wonderful speakers. One is Cheryl Nenn, as you can see here. She's Riverkeeper with the Milwaukee Riverkeeper, which is a community-led, science-based nonprofit working to protect and improve the health of the waterways in the Milwaukee River Basin. And in her role, Cheryl monitors Milwaukee's rivers for pollution and seeks solutions. She works on a very broad variety of issues, but relevant to today, she's been really engaged in data center issues, particularly on the impacts of these hyperscale data centers on water. And she'll be sharing a little bit more about that with us today and taking a closer look at some of the ongoing major data center projects, particularly in the Milwaukee area. And our second speaker today is Tressie Kamp, who is the Assistant Director for the Center for Water Policy at the School of Freshwater Sciences at UW-Milwaukee. The Center for Water Policy provides solutions to resolve regional, national, and international problems related to the protection, restoration, and conservation of freshwater resources. And Tressie also brings a long history of environmental work with her today. As you can imagine, she's been working on data centers a lot as well, for example, on their water demands and possible solutions, which she'll be sharing with us a little bit later today. And so with that, welcome again, and I'm going to pass it over to Tressie to get us started.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Hope everyone is doing well. If we could go, yep, advanced slides. Thanks for that. In addition to some of the background that Jadine was kind enough to give, I grew up in the Appleton area. So a shout out to all of those of you in the chat that I see are from the area. I grew up right up the hill from the Fox River during the Fox River PCB cleanup, and one of a number of reasons that it's a real privilege to work on water law and policy issues and to work with impacted members of the public and NGO and decision makers like all of you that are on the meeting today. So really appreciate it. The Center for Water Policy is embedded in the School of Freshwater Sciences at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, for any of you who may not be familiar with it. We conduct academic research on water policy dilemmas. We produce peer-reviewed articles for a variety of audiences. So those are law review articles, to use another term. Our other writing product with law review articles, our intended audiences is really wide ranged, everyone from academia, government decision makers, and the public. At the center, we've been researching AI data centers and their water demands for almost 2 years now, a little over 2 years, actually. We began this research by focusing on the water and energy demands of AI data centers. More recently, have moved into a second phase of research that we'll cover today, involving a 50-state legislative review and potential solutions for regulating this emerging industry. I'll provide some names and specific shout outs at the end of the presentation, but I do want to make sure to kick off by emphasizing that all of the research I'm sharing today is a result of hard work of key collaborators on these different phases of research. I want to acknowledge the team, both current and past, at Center for Water Policy, but also we did work with an interested group of NGOs as we pulled together our legislative model for the data center industry and for other large water users, and really appreciate the interested group of those external stakeholders who gave us feedback. So if we could go to the next slide. So overview, I'll be discussing background on AI data centers. I may go somewhat quickly through this. I think it's important to ground us in the basics when we think about these complex issues, but at the same time, I know more and more of us have been, I'm seeing in the chat, many of you are impacted by proposals, and many of us are, we're just seeing AI data centers and their impacts more and more in the media, but we have been presenting at the center for a number of years when kind of a baseline understanding of AI data centers was a little bit less common. So I'll go through that baseline. I'll discuss electricity and water demands. I'll discuss those legislative options. And then most importantly, I think, is just leaving you all with the center's research and other resources that you may want to be aware of. It's a great pleasure to be here with Cheryl. I've been privileged to work with Cheryl in a number of different capacities. So in the middle of some of these bullet points, I'll hand it over to her to really talk about some real world examples and work on the ground, whereas we are doing kind of the academic, non-lobbying, non-advocacy piece of the research. All right, let's go to the next slide, please. Okay. What is a data center? So here, I think because of translation between PowerPoint and the Google slides, we've lost the back graphic on this. Usually as I advance through the slides, the graphics show differently, which I think we'll adjust to, and I can provide in a different format with both graphics for folks who are interested. So as we're all hearing more and more about data centers, growing industry, we have about 4,000 in the United States. That's as of February 2026. So especially in this field, it's important to note that number is probably already very different. Northern Virginia, as of now, is the highest concentration kind of data center capital in the United States, but we may have seen, as many of you may have seen, discussion around other parts of the country that are really pushing, places like Texas, wide variety of ecosystems and areas that are looking to host a high concentration of these as well. What is a data center? It's a facility that contains IT infrastructure such as servers, routers, and storage systems. These facilities are essential for all of us to do many of our everyday tasks, things like sending emails, surfing the web, storing photos and videos, streaming media and shows. For the purposes of our discussion today, these facilities most importantly support AI and support crypto, but there is a long list of other functions that these facilities serve. It's important to note, like many environmental issues, this is one where our actions and our decisions make a difference. As our tech use grows, so too does the industry respond and continue to grow as well. There are different sizes of data centers. Many, again, on the map that's hidden in the back graphic here, kind of show number of data centers and different locations. It's important to note that this map and the data center discussion encompasses data centers of a wide variety of sizes. Many on the map here and on the table that we're discussing at the front graphic are smaller data centers. These are data centers that may have been around for a while. I remember having a conversation with a consultant who does permitting, who was talking about a data center permitting process back in 2016 and earlier. These facilities have been in our community, and it's important to realize that, but what we are seeing is faster growth and bigger facilities. Essentially, like I mentioned earlier, as our computing and IT needs have grown, the size of data centers and also the number of data centers have grown. Also, their needs for land, electricity, and water. The center focuses our research on water impacts, but it is important, and many of you are in impacted communities and know this more intimately than me. There are impacts far beyond water use, things like air quality, land use, traffic, things like that. So don't want to minimize those impacts, but I will be focusing on these hyperscale or AI data centers, as we call them, and their water impacts. AI and crypto, again, are really major contributors to this growth. For instance, in 2024, the total energy used by all 1,230 data centers in the top locations in the US, you can see this on the bottom right-hand side of the table here, that was 10.7 gigawatts. Let's compare that slightly more recently in 2025, as many of us may have seen, OpenAI announced plans for an overarching AI infrastructure platform, or what they called Stargate data centers, 5 sites with 10 gigawatts of capacity. Again, for our research, we're focusing on these AI data centers. As we see in these numbers, what's really changing and changing most quickly are these centers that are being proposed at such a high scale. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay. And again, I think because of the change in format, some of the bullet points behind were hidden, but the bullet points I'll discuss in the graphic here is really what's important. So why do these AI data centers require so much water? Let's put it in more personal terms. Using AI to draft a 100-word email can use between 1/2 to 3 bottles of water, and that does depend on the location of where you're doing that search. However, what's significant is that to even get to that point, many of us are seeing these estimated, water or electricity use per AI search that we may do on our phone. But to get to the point where an end user is, having that water or electricity impact, we have to train AI. And a team of researchers estimated that about 22 million liters of water were used to train Meta's AI model. So it's really important to consider the full lifespan of AI, its creation, its use, when we're talking about water demands. So there is one graphic in the back here. Again, I apologize, that's missing. As that we often use a pie chart. It's one of my favorite graphics. And one thing I do want to have you all leave with is kind of, if you not already having these discussions as you respond to these facilities, is the difference between indirect and direct water use. 2024 report from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab to Congress showed that in 2023, our US data centers consumed approximately 17 billion gallons of water for cooling. So that's what we call direct water use. And frankly, that's still what a lot of the dialogue around data centers is focusing on, is the direct use to keep these hot and thirsty facilities cool and functioning. The number that's bigger, however, is indirect water use. And that same 2024 report showed that the indirect water use for data centers in the US in 2023 was 211 billion gallons to produce electricity to power these centers. So a lot of you on the call affiliated with Healthy Climate of Wisconsin, when we're starting to talk about the energy impacts and climate impacts, that's a really big piece of the of the pie or the pie chart here. I do also want to emphasize that water consumed means it's not returned to be treated or used in the immediate area where it's withdrawn. So withdrawal does not equal consumption. These high consumption numbers that we're talking about, where we're not returning it to the same area, is associated with electricity. Still, we are at a place where the AI data centers that we're talking about, the fuel comes from fossil fuels or nuclear. These are ways of producing electricity that we certainly rely on for other purposes beyond AI data centers, but we are aware that they are some of the more resource intensive means of producing electricity. These electricity producers are already some of the highest water users in the US. To put it another way, if solar and wind powered these AI data centers, they could use significantly less water. One question that many of you may be getting as you're working on these facilities being proposed in your neck of the woods is, are these facilities really going to have a water use impact that's different than things like agriculture or other large water users? Because comparatively, especially to industries like agriculture, this is a new industry. It's important that we all keep pushing for research to answer this question. But even the available data that we do have shows that AI data centers do report to use a large portion of water supplies. I can give one Midwest example. In the Des Moines suburb of Altoona, Iowa, a single data center was using up to 20% of the total water use of that suburb in 2024. This brings us all into potential conflict between high water users, but also ratepayers, taxpayers, and high water users. We can, and we have for other industries, tried to regulate or resolve these conflicts, but it's really important to note that for rapidly changing and growing industries, like AI data centers, we're still dealing with some transparency issues and lack of data that will help us understand the real water and electricity impacts. And as a result of that knowledge, being able to follow up and potentially regulate this industry. All right, let's move to the next slide, please. All right, so closed loop systems. I know that, US-wide, but in Wisconsin, we are dealing with proposals that include closed loop systems. Many of you may have been digging into this with your coalitions locally, but just to make sure that we talk through this, we have, in general, two different types of cooling technologies, air versus water cooled. For purposes of time, the air or the air cooling, really, we can define it as kind of a giant air conditioner. Okay, so a system that we're all a little bit more familiar with. Water cooling gets a little bit more complex. Here on the right side, we have two methods of water cooling. One is closed loop, one is evaporative. This system, as the name suggests, uses water to cool equipment. In the closed loop system, hot air from the servers, you can see at the top of the graphic there, rises to a heat exchanger. It's merged with cool water. That water takes in the heat. It's cooled by chillers, and water is piped to units. This same cycle repeats over and over again with new water inputs. And I'm sorry, that's the evaporative on the far right side of the slide. Closed loop system, as it suggests, does not require that constant input of new water. However, this is, at least at the scale of AI data centers, a relatively new technology. There are chemicals added to these closed loop systems that need to be refreshed, and there is still a need to refresh these closed loop systems with new water on a regular basis. Many facilities with the closed loop, newer infrastructure are keeping a hold on certain information for us to understand these systems, saying that they may be proprietary, confidential, trade secrets. So it's hard, although we're seeing some slow but certain improvements in transparency to get reliable info about key aspects of closed loop systems. To summarize, these systems that we just discussed are really the reason that data centers are so resource intensive. As with so many of these issues, there are nuances, but in general, the electricity to cool these systems are really the reason that these facilities are using so much electricity and so much water. Next slide, please. All right, electricity demands, again, remember that the electricity is the input that's required for whether it's closed loop system or evaporative to water for these cooling systems. Electricity demands compared to some other users, these AI data centers are online 100% of the time. They require a constant supply of electricity. And as we discussed before, in general, these facilities are still relying on fossil fuels. In 2022, data centers accounted for about 3% of US electricity use, and that number is expected to reach 8% by 2030. Although again, I think it's really important to stress how quickly these numbers and estimates can change as data keeps coming out. Those numbers may not seem high, but when we zoom into particular areas of the state, like Virginia, kind of data center capitals, the picture starts to look a little bit different. Just again, as one example, Virginia is home to 13% of the world's data centers and 25% of the US data centers. Data centers in Virginia, though, use the same amount of electricity needed to power 60% of the homes in the state. So we're seeing kind of their percentage of, their percentage presence in Virginia much less than the percentage of comparative electricity that these facilities require. Okay. Many of you on this, you're going to have more sustainability expertise than me. Right now we're presenting our research from kind of an academic perspective, but I will point out, and all of you can keep your important work going. I will point out that this is not sustainable. Renewable energy at this point can be too intermittent to meet these constant demands of data centers. This is contrary to climate and economic goals. Again, fossil fuels are still the primary source of power to meet these AI data center demands. Pictured on the right here, although we're seeing this in Wisconsin, and it's important to know that this isn't a one-off situation, but just to give one case study, in Omaha, Nebraska, a coal power plant was slated for decommissioning. However, its life was extended to meet the energy demands of data centers in the area. The coal plant that's pictured here is already near low income and largely minority neighborhoods that already are dealing and facing with some of the worst air pollution and highest rates of asthma in the region. A research team at Cornell University determined that by 2030, the rate of AI growth in the US would put an additional 24 to 44 million metric tons of carbon dioxide into our atmosphere and use as much water as 6 to 10 million Americans each year. So definitely the sustainability and electricity side of this, we call it kind of the energy water nexus. It's really important to acknowledge that nexus and acknowledge the electricity and sustainability impacts of this industry. I believe I'm handing it off to Cheryl here, but maybe advance to the next slide just to make sure I'm not missing anything. Thanks.
Thanks, Tressie. It's a great background. So I'm going to just pop in here and talk a little bit about a few of the data centers that we've been tracking and are aware of. And so in particular, looking at the OpenAI data center, the Oracle data center up in Port Washington, and also what's happening in Mount Pleasant. And those two data centers, I think together are going to be using the same amount of energy as apparently all the households in Wisconsin, I think, according to a Clean Wisconsin study. So these are very large and kind of precedent-setting data centers here. So we have been following the Port Washington facility, I'd probably say since early 2025. And as Tressie mentioned, there's the water landscape, and I think as well as the other facets of these plants have really been changing really quickly. So originally they were saying they were going to need around 1 million gallons per day. That's what was kind of being planned for Port Washington in terms of the amount of water they'd have to get to the facility. And that has changed pretty significantly. Cloverleaf, which is one of these companies that comes in and essentially buys property and puts things together, they originally had pitched a lot of numbers that are antiquated now. And then a new kind of shell company came in that's called Vantage, who's now currently, I think managing the site. And then we found out that essentially they'd be leasing this to OpenAI and Oracle for this lighthouse project. They own right now around 1,675 acres in Port Washington, which is really a staggering number. And if people have driven by it on off of I-43 there, you've seen it. I think it takes like 2 to 3 minutes to drive past it at this point. But the site is around 672 acres. This is the actual active development site, which is also massive. And then there are 4 buildings that are kind of pictured here that they're going to be building. Total is around 59 acres just in building like footage, which is pretty insane. So they originally they were saying they were going to be using open cooling, which everybody was, I think, very concerned about. The new, in August, Vantage basically said that they were going to be switching to a fully closed loop system, which Tressie just, mentioned to us. That they wouldn't be using any evaporative elements and would be using roughly about 22,000 gallons per day. They said that they would be effectively using 0 water for the closed loop system and that most of this would be for bathrooms. That number has already changed pretty significantly. I think the most recent number that I have now is, well, they're still saying they're going to be using anyway, it's been, I think I have it in the next slide actually, but it's increasing to around I think maybe around 4 times that. So right now they are still saying, to Port Washington in terms of the water they're going to be acquiring, that they are using around roughly 1 million gallons per day. But they're saying that's not necessarily what they're going to be using for the facility. But rather, they're kind of using that as a planning number so that they would have enough water for firefighting purposes. And so that's kind of like the size for, looking at the size of piping and things like that. So the numbers for the water use are still a little bit squishy. And they are, and I think to Tressie's point, yep, I think that's right. Don wrote the building would cover 2.5 million square feet, which is a kind of massive number. So they're essentially, using this 1 million gallon per day planning number, but are saying it's going to be much less than that. This doesn't include the indirect water use for energy. There recently was, I think, an article a few weeks ago now, which, and I think that Clean Wisconsin did a small study, but they're saying that the energy for this plant alone, they think is going to be probably roughly 54 million gallons of water a day just for the plant, or I guess the combined energy sources for this plant that would be generating electricity. That includes, they would be getting some energy from Point Beach, which is a nuclear facility, and some energy from the port natural gas plant, and putting in potentially some solar and other energy options. Obviously this indirect water use, I think for energy will be, the really large footprint, especially for like a closed loop system. It might seem like they're not using a lot of water for the closed loop system itself, but that doesn't really look at that, the increased energy that you need to actually run a closed loop system, because there's a lot of pumping involved. And so they're going to need a lot of energy to keep all of those data center components cool. And this plant originally, what they were saying 1.3 gigawatts, which is, essentially the equivalent to an hourly use of energy for about 640,000 homes. But now they're saying that could end up going up to, close to 3.5 gigawatts. The port treatment plant, they currently only have about 4 million gallons of water per day that they send to the city of Port. And as part of this development as well, they're kind of anticipating or hoping for commercial and residential use kind of bringing around the data center. So I think the last I heard up there, they're still going to have to, probably invest in some significant upgrades to be able to supply water to the facility, which could be, some $4 to $6 million. Again, they're now saying from like the wastewater perspective that they'd be sending, roughly, and this is in the recent environmental assessment they did late last year, that they're planning for 13,000 gallons of water per day that would go to the wastewater plants, with up to another 117,000 more gallons that would be for kind of associated commercial sites. So that's like, in general, like 130,000 or so wastewater gallons that would be going to the site. But as Tressie also mentioned, a lot of these statistics are changing pretty quickly. Can we go to the next slide, please? So this is again the closed loop system graphic that Tressie had in her presentation. So as I just mentioned, this looks like a fairly small amount of water. They're saying around 13,000 gallons of human waste, mostly from people working at the facilities, would be going, for treatment. And that they have like these other commercial sites that they would envision would have some wastewater. Talking a little bit about what's going to be in the water. So in a closed loop system, they add often like propylene glycol or an ethylene glycol, which is essentially a de-icer. And they will be adding that to the water. It's kind of like a coolant to keep the systems cool. And they might change the percentage of how much glycol is in that water based on how hot it is outside. I don't think we fully know the quantity of water or how much water it would take to fill up all of the piping systems. They did say in their environmental assessment that they would be capturing and disposing that glycol from the closed loop system, and sending it to essentially a third-party treatment facility, which is, I'm guessing, like a pre-treatment facility, which we have some level of concern about just because of kind of the under-regulation of pre-treatment. Which is probably another PowerPoint presentation. But they also have like these strainers and filters throughout the system that each one would have to be cleaned annually. And they estimated about 3 gallons of water for each one of those. Again, that would probably end up, you'd have wastewater coming from that would have like biocides, like antifungal type chemicals so that fungus isn't growing in there. Different adjusting chemicals for pH, and then a corrosion inhibitor. A lot of the corrosion inhibitors also, I think, important to note, generally have a lot of phosphorus in them. So that's something that is a, huge pollutant of concern for a lot of our waterways. Right now, I think even like last fall, they said they were talking with the treatment plant about how and when those slugs of wastewater would hit the wastewater plant. It now appears in that recent EA that they're saying that all of this is going to go to a third-party vendor for treatment. So would be doing some level of pre-treatment on the water, the internal water that's actually being used in the facility. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So in addition to, it sounds like there's not a lot of water being used in that facility itself. Everything is changing pretty quickly. And there's also that massive water impact, potentially, up to 50 million gallons of water that would be used a day to create the power for this facility. There's also, this is, as we mentioned before, very large. The first, that first phase is around 670 acres. We know that they filed 3 different applications now for what are called non-federal wetland exemptions. So if you guys remember the whole waters of the U.S., kind of debacles that have been happening over the last 5 years, if you have a wetland and it's not directly connected to a running water body, let's say, or like a lake or a navigable, piece of water, that those are now no longer covered under, under the Clean Water Act for protection. They have filed for 3 different applications, mostly late last year, and for a total like impact to around roughly 7 acres of wetland, of which I think 4.7 acres of that wetland will be filled completely. I was not even aware of that. I don't think that there was really any ability for public comment. We know that they're saying that they are expecting around 800 acres of disturbance, and that about 300 of those acres would eventually become prairie. But this is, going to be a very large area that was farmland that's now going to become, rooftops and parking lots and lay down spaces for construction that will be compacted, which is, likely to, have a major impact on waterways. They state in their environmental assessment that there will be no impacts either on site or downstream to any waterways. You can see the kind of graphic on the left here just shows some of the creeks and how they interact with the site. So we don't necessarily believe them that there won't be any impacts, and are kind of trying to work with some of the local residents to come up with some monitoring plans so that we can more actively monitor runoff to the site. In particular, there's some pretty large total suspended solid loads that are being, predicted to be running off the site. Even if they meet their 80% control of runoff, which is kind of our state law, there's still, you're talking about, tens of tons of sediment that would be going into these creeks every year. So again, they're talking about 54 acres of wet detention basins, which is kind of a number also that boggles the mind. Wet detention basins can help with short-term water quality, but there's also, they also often breed bacteria, and there's other issues with them that can impair water quality downstream, especially in a lot of our urban waters that are struggling with kind of high bacteria levels already. So again, I think there likely are to be very long-term impacts to stormwater quality and quantity from all this impervious surface. I think the developers are, putting out a very rosy picture. They've even claimed that they think there'd be less runoff coming from the site, compared to pre-construction, which seems boggling. But we also have major concerns from the transmission lines. And we know right now there's a preferred route and an alternative route. And they would, both of those routes impact around between 106 and 115 different waterways. And that's a number from their environmental assessment. Can we go to the next slide, please? So I think transitioning, well, and I also just say with the transmission centers or with the transmission lines, I think there's a huge concern too with that between like dozens to hundreds of acres of wetland that would be impacted as part of the transmission line construction. I think I didn't include that slide, but and huge waterway impacts that are projected, which is very concerning from an environmental perspective. Just so transitioning quickly, I think I have a few slides on Microsoft. I think as folks know, this is another one that's just been changing. It was like a 4 billion project, and then 8 billion, and then the recent number I saw was 20 billion. This is the Mount Pleasant facility. So the current construction that is kind of close to being done is what they call Area 3B, which is kind of that square off to the right. And so, and there's at least 2 other future phases, and then this doesn't include some of the other more recent announcements in the Kenosha plant, which I think I have on another slide. But, this is a very, large, even the first building, if you've driven by that off of Highway KR, it's about 1.1 million square feet. This is just the current construction covering around 215 acres. And as I mentioned, we had a situation where we had FOIA'd information on, or did a public record request on how much water the facility would be using. They kind of bounced us around between Racine and Mount Pleasant because this is largely being built in Mount Pleasant, but the water would be coming from Racine through a Great Lakes diversion that they sought for Foxconn. And so we had filed a notice of intent with Midwest Environmental Advocates, and after them bouncing us around for about 6 months, they told us it was proprietary and they wouldn't tell us. And so then we filed basically a notice of intent to sue. And then we did get information back, I think like a day later. But again, I think these numbers are largely, I don't believe them, and I think they're antiquated at this point. They were saying that this first construction, this Area 3B, would be about 2 million gallons of water per year. And that they thought that would eventually get up to something closer there's like this table, there's water demand on the left and wastewater discharge on the right. So you can see that there's a big difference in those numbers, and a lot of that's the consumptive use that Tressie was talking about. So water that's being consumed throughout the processes and resulting in less water that's being treated at the wastewater side of things. They're saying with the future phases, they said that they'd be using up to 8 million gallons of water per year. A recent article I just saw said that they were estimating now that all of these phases would use between 15,000 and 468,000 gallons of water per day on the most hot days where they would need to use extra water for cooling. If you look at 468,000 gallons per day, like 4 days would get you to that 2 million gallons, right? So there's always been some confusion about those numbers. They did say that, days over 85 degrees, they would switch to more liquid cooling. And for example, in 2025, we had 40 days that were over 85. So that alone would be like 3 million gallons just for those 40 days. And that's like looking at just their first building that's going into operation, which is that Area 3B. And that's well over the 2 million gallons they're saying they're going to use for an entire year. They basically said most of the 90% of the facility would rely on that closed loop system, but they would use outside air and switch to waters on those hot days. This is apparently being built. I don't know if this is still correct, but they said it's going to be the world's second largest chiller, next to, I think, a facility in Dubai. And essentially it's taking that water through a series of pipes. It's about 60 miles of pipes, and using giant fans to essentially like pipe that water through the system and then out, basically into the air. And again, this is really the information we have mostly on the one that's currently largely constructed. So, again, looking at that the Great Lakes Compact, generally the regional approval would be triggered at around 5 million gallons of water per day. They're saying, initially they'll be using 2 million gallons of water per year. So that doesn't really trigger that level, but certainly this seems like it's a very dynamic process. Whether or not we're going to be able to get a good sense of how much water they're actually using is a little tricky because we'll have to get that information through Racine, who's actually sending them the water, as Tressie mentioned. And so separating that out from every other water user in Racine, I think could be a little tricky. But that's something we'll have to just continue to monitor. And again, this isn't really looking at the incredible amount of water that will be used in the indirect or the energy generation, which they also are planning to keep a coal burning power plant in Oak Creek that was supposed to be closed 2 years ago. They're now, basically keeping that thing running just for this data center. And, again, the energy for this data center and the Port Washington data center will be equivalent to the energy being used by every home in Wisconsin right now. And that's according to the study from Clean Wisconsin. Can we go to the next slide? All right, so I think this is my last slide. I just wanted to mention briefly, there is another new phase that they've just are talking about in Mount Pleasant. Again, these are, I think totally Microsoft has around 1,600 acres in Racine right now, which is very, in Mount Pleasant, which is, maybe pretty commensurate to the Port Washington one. This third phase too is going to be another 3-building section that's to the far west of their sites. We've also just learned the Caledonia plant was kind of canceled, which was incredibly great news. The Kenosha plant, which I think you'll hear a little bit more about from the Sierra Club staff, right now that's about a 240-acre, 1 million square feet facility that's being looked at. I don't know as much about this plant, but I think from what I've heard, it's about 4 different buildings that are 1 story. Clearly not going to employ that many employees, kind of a smaller operation. However, they also are talking about using a closed loop system and using potentially different water or additional water on the hottest days of the years. They also are, there's 2 different options for a power plant to power the site. And one of the options would essentially use a high capacity well, and then water would be sent to the Des Plaines River. That's their not preferred alternative. Their preferred alternative would get water from Summers, Wisconsin, which also has a Great Lakes diversion. It's for a straddling community. They would get water from Summers and then return that water, I think, to Racine for treatment. And I think, certainly, I think with climate change, we're definitely going to have a lot more hot days moving forward. So I think a lot of these estimates are probably going to change, pretty dramatically. And so I think that's all I have, and we'll send it back to Tressie to talk about statewide policy.
Great, thank you. I always learn so much when I hear from Cheryl. So turning to one potential responsive action, given the lack of transparency that we've discussed today around resource impact data, given the potentially very large demands on electricity and water for a hosting community of an AI data center, 1 or more, we started working on evaluating legislative responses to this emerging industry. And specifically, we conducted a 50-state review of proposed and enacted legislation affecting AI data center development. Using this review, the center developed a legislative model organized around 5 overarching goals that I'll run through pretty quickly. The goals reflect key issues of public concern in Wisconsin and beyond, and capture a range of legislative responses that are currently emerging. It's important to note that rather than mirroring a single state or local framework, the model draws on approaches from multiple states and, where appropriate, even incorporates original draft provisions to address gaps that we identified. Our overall arching goal was to reflect emerging better practices for regulating this emerging system. What we are presenting is a menu of legislative options. They can be adopted individually or in combination. They do form a comprehensive legislative package to address all of the 5 goals that I'll run through, but each option can and is designed to function as a standalone response depending on a state's priorities, political reality, and context going on in any particular state. This work is definitely grounded in rapid growth of AI data centers, but many of these responses are intentionally structured, so states may choose to apply them more broadly, or in other words, to other large water and electricity users, with the goal of ensuring consistent treatment of high impact resource users across sectors and avoiding the creation of an AI specific carve out if a broader approach is more appropriate and more palatable in certain areas. Next slide, please. So here are the 5 goals. There is a link here to the legislative model that's publicly available. The first goal is to improve comprehensive planning so that states and regions can better assess risks and rewards of hosting these facilities, along with other economic development priorities. Our second goal is to increase transparency and public disclosure to support more democratic participation in hosting decisions. Third is to protect ratepayers, all of us, ensure that residents and other businesses are not left bearing higher utility costs driven by large energy intensive facilities. So you'll note that goals 1 through 3 aren't environmental goals per se, because the impacts of these facilities extend beyond what we might consider traditional environmental impacts to impacts on public protection more generally. Things like transparency, right to know, impacts, community planning. Fourth goal, we do move to more traditional environmental goals, establishing energy and water efficiency prerequisite to be eligible in order for an AI data center to be eligible for permits or tax incentives. Finally, our 5th goal is to increase funding for water management and conservation. It's important, as we've talked about today, to better track data on current and future water and energy demands, and for all of us as interested public and decision makers to respond to changing conditions over time. Next slide, please. Okay, so in the interest of time, I won't go through or read through all of the sub goals under the headers in bold here, but I will note that for each of the 5 goals, we went through and proposed, again, based on that 50 state survey, proposed specific language for primarily states to use for state level legislation, but also to a certain extent, local governments as well. So each of these sub-goals have proposed language as part of a legislative model. Many of you, or maybe perhaps not many of you, I did see in the chat, at least a few of you are in communities that have been responding by enacting moratoria. So we did propose language there. I know many communities in Wisconsin and beyond are responding to non-disclosure agreements or NDAs between some of these facilities and elected decision makers. So there is proposed another provision that we've gotten a lot of interest in at the center is this prohibition on NDAs. So again, in the interest of time and kind of for the purposes of this lunch and learn, I'll just leave all of these here and make the note that there is proposed language for all of these goals and then sub goals as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so some resources that I wanted to make all of you aware of, excuse me. So we have the legislative model that again is already publicly available on our website. Many of the transparency concerns that Cheryl and I both discussed today were subject of a fall 2025 law review article that we published, also available on our website. We do have very shorter form articles on the impacts of AI data centers. Please feel free to take a look at those. Those include things like written shorter pieces, but also more recently FAQ style videos that we are grateful to produce in coordination and with the support of the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. So just wanted to leave you here with these resources. This is a topic that we could discuss for much longer, and I know that we went through a lot. So hopefully at least leaving all of you with some potential resources moving forward will be useful. Next slide, please. All right, some overarching conclusions from the center's research and those resources that I just mentioned. The energy and water demands of AI data centers are certainly significant, and probably equally as important to note is we're not really seeing an end in sight, right? Based on all of our continued use of AI and our IT needs. There is and continues to be a lack of accessibility and transparency. We need to make more information on resource impacts and otherwise more available to the general public and our elected officials. Clear information on these resource demands is essential. Without this, we cannot make informed public and government decisions about the pros and cons of hosting these AI data centers. And finally, the legislative policy goals that I very quickly went through could help mitigate these problems and are likely one part of a much more complex and diverse toolbox that can help many sectors, ranging again, academia to decision makers to the impacted public, try and figure out how to address and mitigate these problems, both in the short and long term. I think my next slide is just a thank you and also a note to other team members who helped with this research. And thanks to all of you for taking time out of your day. I'll hand it back. I don't know if Cheryl, if you have any conclusions or anything you wanted to say. Otherwise, we can hand it back to Sierra Philip to see where you want to spend our last few minutes.
Sounds good.
I'm going to walk us through a couple of quick ways to take action right now, and then we will get to some of those questions in the meantime while I'm sharing ways you can take action immediately. Some of our speakers are going to go into the chat and kind of see some of the questions there, and we'll try to get to some out loud as well. But I'm going to cover three main ways we can take action: submitting a comment or testifying on upcoming gas plant cases, taking local action, pushing for that moratoria that was mentioned above, and then joining us to advocate for statewide protections. Next slide. So as you heard from speakers today, there are a lot of gas plants currently being proposed to power data centers that would use our water and pollute our air. So we have an action alert that you can take this week, actually. So next slide. There are two gas plants being proposed right now being considered by the Public Service Commission. They are Foundry Ridge, which is 324 megawatts, located in Darien, Wisconsin, which is Walworth County in southeast Wisconsin. And then Red Oak Ridge gas plant, which is 1,200 megawatts. This is in Paris, which is in Kenosha County, also in southeast Wisconsin. To note that Red Oak Ridge gas plant, both of these are significant sized gas plants, but that Red Oak Ridge would be amongst the largest in our state. That's a huge gas plant at that size. And we are likely to see future gas plants in the queue. We know that we are seeing proposals likely for Appleton area and other spots in Wisconsin, but these are the two currently being considered. So I'm not going to talk about those other proposals that we're seeing today, only the two that we can take action on right now. Next slide. Oh, I just put a water droplet here because the main thing that we're talking about today is water. And so you might be like, why are we talking about gas plants? Next slide. That's because gas plants use a lot of water for everything from their withdrawals to cool their towers to make sure that they are getting all of their equipment. There's so many different pieces of this process that use water. So I'm not going to go into all those details because I just looked at the time. But I want to draw your eye to that pie chart on the bottom left there. This is a chart from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources about water withdrawals in 2024. So you can see this includes everything from agriculture to the public water supply and manufacturing. The huge piece of that pie chart at 73% is power generation from fossil fuel plants in Wisconsin. So when we're talking about water withdrawals in the state, how we're getting our power is a huge piece of that. I'm going to primarily talk about gas today, but coal and nuclear also use an immense amount of water. Wind and solar do not at the point of generation. Next slide. So to put that in perspective, because we don't usually talk about things in the scale of millions of gallons, that's not the way we live our lives as everyday people. But Red Oak Ridge and Foundry Ridge gas plant would use 21 million gallons, which is equivalent to the annual drinking water for 115,000 people and almost 21,000 fire trucks or over a million showers. So just to give you a sense of that scale for just those two gas plants alone. Next slide. So here are a few ways you can take action. The first hearing actually is this week. So this Thursday, the Foundry Ridge gas plant goes to a public hearing. You can attend it online on Zoom and speak that way or at the Darien Public Library. It's at 2 and 6 p.m. If there are enough attendees, those time periods sometimes bleed into one another. So it's worth logging on or joining in between if you can only make it at that time. Then there also will be a hearing next week, July 23rd, on the Red Oak Ridge gas plant at the Paris Safety Building and also on Zoom. For both of those, if you are not able to speak at either of those public hearings, you can also submit a written comment at the Public Service Commission website. Their deadlines are July 23rd and August 3rd, and we have talking points and more information to help you take action on both of those. So I'm gonna put in the chat now two different websites for taking action that cover kind of different pieces of this problem, and both are really great. So check them out to learn more. And then next slide. And then I only mentioned those gas plants, so I'm gonna go over the others really quick. Two more ways. We have a toolkit for community action. This was created by 4 different organizations in the state, including the Sierra Club and Healthy Climate Wisconsin, who are here today, but also Wisconsin Green Fire and the Midwest Environmental Advocates. This is a great toolkit that covers case studies in our communities, local permitting processes, tools, and resources for how your community can take action to protect all that you care about, including water. Next slide. And then I know we covered a little bit of some of these projects, but I also wanted to share a note of hope. I think there's a lot going on in the world, so it can be hard to sometimes hear some of those good stories come through the news. But there are a lot of communities that have been pushing back, raising concerns, and actually are seeing changes made to proposals and or they're getting completely canceled. So here's a map of the recent projects we've seen in this state. Everything in red has actually been canceled due to local community pushback. Yellow is paused. Light blue are those that we know are currently proposed, and dark blue are the sites that are currently in construction. I want to note here that if you don't see your community on the map, it doesn't mean that it's not at risk. Oftentimes we hear about these proposals a little bit late because of the non-disclosure agreements. Next slide. And as mentioned by one of the speakers, a lot of moratoria are also going in place. These are just a few examples. They are all across the state and changing really by the week. So if you're not sure if you have one, it's worth looking up your local community or talking to your council to see if one is being considered. Next slide. And then, last but not least, it's important when we're fighting for statewide protections for every voice to be heard in this process. And the more of us that come together, the more likely we are to get the strongest protections for our communities. There are a lot of communities speaking up right now and coming together, and we want you to be there alongside us. So this is the call to action to join a group or organization taking on this issue if this is something you deeply care about. And then we are at time, and I see that a lot of questions were answered in the chat. But we will stick around for a moment to make sure we get to some of those Q&A questions. Thank you so much for spending your lunch with us. I hope you learned a lot about water and data centers and ways you can take action right away. Great. I'm looking in the chat. It looks like we got to most of those questions. There's a few about where the water comes from. So maybe I'll grab a couple of these questions and then maybe we can just answer a few of them and send them out via email, and then we can send out slides as well. Does that sound good?
Sure.
All right. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
You too. Thank you.